Hello everyone and welcome back to Languages Week 2023. I'm your host, Georgie McComb. This entire week is in collaboration between Radio Monash and the Monash School of Languages, Literature, Culture and Linguistics. Throughout the week, we will be sharing interviews from both the dedicated teaching staff and students from clubs and societies who will be here to tell us a little bit more about studying a language and engaging in the culture. Alongside interviews, we will be playing music from around the world in different languages as well. We literally have every language under the sun. We have got Indonesian, Spanish, Japanese, French. If you want to learn about new cultures and engage in some new music, we literally have it all. So if you want to find out when stuff is playing at what time, check out our social media pages and our website. But today, from the Japanese language program, I am here with Eliza. Welcome, Eliza. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Eliza Nicoll. I teach Japanese here at Monash Uni. I teach introductory, but also across all of the cultural units as well. So all the electives I teach in. I'm a translator by trade.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So I am currently finishing up a PhD and my main area of translation focus is actually translating survivor accounts of the bombing of Hiroshima.
Wow, that's really interesting because I feel like one of the things that students really ask is where can I go with Japanese? And what's interesting about your story is you were a student at Monash and you started studying Japanese here. So do you want to talk a bit about coming in with someone who you know Japanese?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. So I started actually was enrolled in a Bachelor of Sciences and I got a week in and I was like, what am I doing here? This is not what I want to do. So I pulled out and to fill time took a French lesson and really, really enjoyed it. So I came back to Monash and enrolled in a Bachelor of Languages, it was called at the time, though it no longer exists. And French was my major and I had to pick a second language that was completely different. My boyfriend at the time said, why don't you study Japanese? So I was like, great, why not? And I fell in love with it. I knew nothing about Japanese language or Japanese culture before sitting down and opening that textbook for the first time, but very, very quickly fell in love with everything about it.
Yeah, I can imagine. So did you find it very intimidating, I guess? Like, for instance, with French, obviously, like the same alphabet and whatnot, but Japanese, whole, like 3 alphabets?
Yeah, so it is, and it was intimidating because we had to learn it so quickly. I think back in my day, it was week 1, you learn hiragana, week 2, you learn katakana, and then from week 3, you're learning the Chinese characters. So it was really rapid fire that we had to do it, and that was intimidating. But I think kind of getting thrown in the deep end is one of the best ways to learn sometimes. You just have to do it, and eventually it does get easier. So yeah, it was a lot more work than something like French was at the beginning, but it definitely paid off in the end.
Definitely. So then I guess as someone who's been on both ends, as in as a student and as a teacher, if a student wanted to come and say, oh, I really want to learn Japanese, but I'm so intimidating. It's so intimidating. What advice would you give to them?
I think you just have to go with it. It is, languages in general, it's a lot. It's a lot to learn, and you kind of never, ever get to that end point. There's always something new to learn. So the earlier that you kind of accept that and go, okay, this is something that I still really love and really want to engage in, the earlier you can kind of overcome that fear and that intimidation and just go with the flow, the easier it actually gets. The more you kind of give into that intimidation, the harder it's going to be, is what I try to always tell my students, is just embrace it. Yeah. Find something that you love about it, and that will make it easier.
Absolutely, and I can really second that. I think you can't learn a language if you're not motivated or you're not genuinely interested, because it is so difficult. And I was given the example before this interview started where I was learning Italian in primary school. Wasn't my first love, but I've come to university learning French, and because I had that passion for it, it doesn't feel like you're studying anything because it's a passion and everything.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I tell my students too, that learning a language is a marathon. It is not a sprint. You cannot cram it before the exam and expect to do well. Maybe it'll stick for a week while you're studying it, but after that, if you don't maintain it, it's going to atrophy. It's going to drop out of your brain really quickly.
It will.
So the only way to kind of, and there are going to be times where you hate it, where you absolutely despise it. There are times where I'm like, why is this my life? Why did I choose to do this? And in those times, you've always kind of got to have something that reminds you of why you started doing it. to begin with, why you
Definitely,
enjoy
yeah.
it, and then you can go back to it, because even if it's something as, I don't know, weeby as anime or manga, sorry to the weebs out there, you know, if it's something that you enjoy, you can go and engage in it, and it's passive learning at the end of the day. Yeah, it's not sitting there practicing verb conjugations, but you're still absorbing it in some aspect.
Exactly. And I think the best part is I find the introductory and intermediate phase probably the hardest part of learning a language. And once you get such a strong grasp, you're literally just watching movies and engaging in the culture and the media. Like, it doesn't even feel like a chore anymore. Once you've got those solid foundations, you can really go from there. And I also want to hamper on the point, because I have so many people like, I could just learn this at home in 3 months, because there are so many books out there and these hyper polyglot people who do all these interviews on the streets. I'm like, language is so complicated that, and I think you could speak to this, you've been learning it for so long now, but do you still feel like you're like, the idea of fluency is so subjective.
Right. When people say to me, oh, so you're fluent in Japanese, I'm like, well, what is fluency?
Yes.
Like, what does that mean? Yes, my partner is Japanese, so we speak Japanese at home. I watch Japanese TV. I watch Japanese movies. My Instagram is full of Japanese accounts, but like, I couldn't pick up the finance portion of the Japanese newspaper and read it and understand it. So, you know, but there are also things like I couldn't pick up the English finance section of the newspaper and understand a lot of it. So, you know, I would say that I'm fluent in English, but there are aspects of English that I still really struggle with.
Yeah, I think the best example that someone gave to me, especially when they're like, oh, what level are you on the European language scale? Which, for people who don't know, there's A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. The common myth is that C1, I believe, is like, oh, you're like native by then or fluent. And I'm like, if somebody asked me to go into a mechanic shop and said, can you name every single tool? I couldn't even do that in English, let alone my second language. So this idea of fluency is something that you really like unpack when you actually start learning a language, especially at uni.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I try to teach my students as well. I remember when I was learning it, I was so intimidated by the idea of making a mistake. And maybe that's just me and my perfectionism, but I was like, I don't want to, you know, use Japanese. I don't want to speak to Japanese people unless it... Yeah, so it's something I try to teach my students, is that, you know, making mistakes are so important, because when I was learning, I was so afraid of making any kind of mistake ever. And so for years, I was too petrified to even use Japanese, because I was like, well, I don't want to speak unless I'm perfect. And now teaching Japanese, you know, when I moved over there, every single day is like an oral exam.
Yeah.
You just have to speak it and make those mistakes and get over it. You know, I've made some horrific, mortifying mistakes in my life.
Yes. Oh, I relate to that so much.
Yeah. So, you know, but in making those mistakes, you learn and you get better. So as a teacher, it's kind of, I struggle a little bit. I want to encourage my students to, you know, make those mistakes. It doesn't matter if you're not perfect. It doesn't matter if you've got a broken sentence. As long as you're understood, that's the ultimate goal of language and the ultimate goal of communication. But also as a teacher, I have to kind of teach this is right and this is wrong, and you will lose marks if you get it wrong.
Exactly. And to be honest, being in a university environment, the benefit is that you can make mistakes.
Exactly.
Like, I think a part of, you know, society is that stress of you always got to be perfect. And I know a lot of people have some anxiety about, you know, speaking up in class, but this is such a great opportunity, because you're never going to get that one-on-one that you can, to make sure that you really hone in on those grammar points. So how did you find working in Japan? So coming from university and a foreigner, how did you find taking those skills you learned at uni in the workforce?
Yeah. So, well, I moved to Japan, and like most foreigners do when they move to Japan, I taught English. But I worked in this dinky little town, fishing village on the edge of the world, with a population of 10,000 people. And so I mostly taught primary school and kindergarten. So, you know, I'd done a major in Japanese at university. So I started at introductory, finished at proficient, had 3 years, similar to the like European kind of grading of languages. There's a Japanese version, the JLPT level. So I had about N3, which is kind of like the middle level. And I thought that I'd be great. I moved over there and I very quickly learned, okay.
It's like, as soon as you step out, like, what have I gotten myself into?
And especially it was so remote. Their accent was so thick. I was like, I don't understand a word you're saying.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
But, you know, going over there, like I said, every day is a speaking exam. So my Japanese ability because no one spoke any English. So I just had to use Japanese all day, every single day. And my ability skyrocketed. Within 3 months, I was able to, have really, really great conversations with people. I was able to teach in classes entirely in Japanese, even though I was teaching English. And the people over there are so lovely as well. And when you do move over there, especially in those country towns, you're part of the community and they kind of take you under their wing. So like I had a group of little grandmas in the town.
That's so sweet.
Yeah, they would fight over who would have me for dinner that night.
That's so cute. I love that.
It was a fishing village. So some of the teachers I worked with would knock on my door at 7 a.m. with a plate of fresh sashimi that they'd gone out on a boat and caught and chopped up.
Lovely.
Yeah. So, it's a really great experience to be able to go over there and do it. And I think, even if you think that your language ability isn't up to scratch, you just do it because it's never going to be where you want it to be, I think, unless you live over there as well.
Absolutely. And I think too, the more you progress, the more it feels like you don't know anything.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I think when I tell people that, they're like, what do you mean? You know more than before. I'm like, yeah, but once you've got your foot in the pool, you realize that the pool's an Olympic size and that you really have to jump in.
Yeah.
So, and I guess, because you said that you teach a lot of the culture units, how did understanding the culture from university really help with integrating into like Japanese society?
Absolutely. So I think with languages and cultures, they're inseparable. Like you can't learn one without the other.
You heard that here, folks. I know people are like, no, I just want to learn a language. Culture is important.
You cannot have one without the other. They go hand in hand. So, for example, Japanese, the politeness, right? So everyone, Japanese and Japan is known as being polite. And the politeness in Japanese culture is so ingrained in the language that you can't separate the two of them. So having a real understanding of that, understanding sort of Japanese is it's what we call a high context language. So you have to read between the lines a lot. They do not explicitly say anything. So you have to interpret based off, body language cues or language cues or anything like that without knowing those kind of cultural aspects, those socio-linguistic aspects that you can get from the culture units here. Just a little plug for my unit.
Go for it.
Without those aspects, you can't really properly understand. Well, you can get by, but you'll commit a lot of faux pas because...
Yes, I can imagine. And then I guess too, for somebody who isn't necessarily interested in completely immersing themselves in the language, but is really interested in Japanese culture, are those culture units also open to people who aren't studying Japanese?
No. So I do believe that you have to have a prerequisite is to have at least intermediate, so you have to be majoring or minoring. Some of them are, if you're in sort of international relations degrees or things like that, some of them are a bit kind of cross-cultural, but a lot of them are very much focused on, even though they are cultural languages, they are kind of embedded in the language.
You kind of need to know the language to really understand that cultural component.
Yeah.
Well, then I guess elaborating on some of those cultural units, what do you cover? Like, for instance, I know in French we talk about historical moments, movies, film, and how those have shaped society. What do you guys do over in the lovely Japanese program?
Well, so I teach in a unit called Japanese pop culture and identity, which is very fun. So we look at analysing and understanding the Japanese or the concept of Japanese identity through different aspects of pop culture. So we cover a different major movie each week and kind of use that to analyse sort of how Japanese people see and Japanese society sees itself and interprets itself. So we look at stereotypes of gender. We look at sort of the fallout of World War II and kind of the occupation, having to rebuild their society, how that impacted their identity. We look at, the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, all of those sorts of things, and how they shape Japanese society. And then I also teach in a unit called Languages, Literatures and Cultures in Asia. I believe it's a very new unit. I believe that's
well,
the name of it.
You're welcome to plug it. Go for it.
ATS 2274.
You heard it here, people. Is that semester 1 or semester 2?
So semester 2. So I'm going in to teach it this semester. So it's really fun because it's primarily targeted towards Asian languages, obviously. So we look at the 4 Asian languages that we teach at Monash. So Japanese, Korean, Mandarin, and Indonesian. And each week, so we alternate. So we have a language-specific class. So the Japanese students will come to me and we'll learn about an aspect of Japanese sociolinguistics. So, for example, gender within Japanese language, or the writing scripts and how that's been shaped by different stages in Japanese history. And then the next week they have a kind of collective one. So all of the students from different languages are together and they get to talk and compare about how it works in each other's language and look at the similarities and differences.
So you really get that cross-cultural component as well. It's not just specific to Japan. That's
absolutely.
Really cool.
And because, you've got countries and languages like Korean and Japanese, and even though they're different languages, they're both very similar in some ways, very different in others. They're both influenced by Chinese.
Yes.
So there's a lot of interplay between all of the languages there. So it's a really fun way to kind of see influences beyond just the borders of your own country.
Yeah,
as
definitely.
well.
No, that sounds fun.
Yeah, it's really fun.
I wish I could jump over to. that sounds great. I mean, I got to find the elective space.
Yeah.
So I guess with some of the other like cultural stuff, you've obviously had to immerse yourself to like increase those listening skills and increase those comprehension. What are your favorite pieces to recommend? I don't like TV, movies, books, songs. What go? What are your top things?
So, I mean, I'm a big reader. So for me, look, Japanese literature, it can be a little bit depressing at times. They don't really believe much in a happy ending. It's always kind of bittersweet. But I still find it really profound to read. And they do really good crime fiction. So if you're into some dirty noir crime fiction, then give some like Higashi no Keigo a try. He writes some really, really good stories. Also, YouTube. So my partner's obsessed with, he's Japanese obviously, but he just watches YouTube all the time. So I've gotten very familiar with Japanese YouTubers.
And it's quite a large community too.
It's massive.
And I think too that a lot of people are like, oh, where do you find it? There is so much native natural content.
Yes.
But also like a quick disclaimer from my end, if you're still in the intermediate level, jumping into that native stuff, the slang that they just the informal natural way of speaking is so different to what you learn in class.
Absolutely. But that's actually, again, it's also something that I teach my students is that, and it's something I'm always like, learn from my mistakes, please. Yes. I've been here. I've been in your shoes. I know what's hard and what works and what doesn't. And for me, I didn't really start properly consuming Japanese culture or Japanese media until I lived in Japan. And when I started doing that, I got so much better. My Japanese got so much better. And I really regret not doing that earlier, even though it was hard. So like, for example, picking up a volume of manga, a Japanese comic book. When I first was like, I'm going to read one of these, it took me about 2 hours to read 4 pages of it. And I was just like looking up every word and every grammar point. And it was a lot of brute force. It was hard. But then the next day when I picked it up, I could do 4 pages in, an hour and 45 minutes. Yeah. And I got faster and faster and faster. Now I read a volume of manga in like half an hour and my poor bank account cries.
Oh, tell me about it. And also I find too that foreign imported books, there's that tax there. I'm like, you would be like, for me, my French books would be $15 in Europe, but here they're like $25.
Absolutely. That's why if you can get on it, Amazon. Get download digital versions of them. So much cheaper. You can for Japanese anyway. I don't know about Europe, but you can get a Japanese Amazon account and download digital manga, digital books straight onto your phone or your Kindle. Yeah, and it's so much cheaper.
There's so much online, and I think too, the first piece of advice I ever got, which now these are from casual learners, but go look at news and go. I'm like, no, find if you want to study a language, find what you're interested in, and then find the stuff around that, because that's how you're going to learn. And so, did you find that as soon as you really started gauging, your language growth was just like exponential? It was just through the roof.
So much faster, especially with Chinese characters, for example. There's a lot of them. There's for standard everyday use in Japanese, there's 2,000 of them, and they're used in a whole bunch of different combinations to make different words. And you can, learn your vocabulary from your textbook or learn, your flashcards, whatever. You're not actually going to properly memorize them until you see them and you hear them and you use them in context. So that's why during my time in my undergrad, I was just drilling those grammar exercises and those flashcards. And it was enough for me to get good grades, but in reality, it wasn't sticking in my brain. And it's not until you go, oh, hey, I recognize that word. Yeah. That's when you see it and you go, oh, that's how it's used. And that sticks in your brain a lot more. So it actually is really quite fundamental, I think, for learning.
Definitely. And I guess this is a bit of a tangent, but it kind of comes back to it. A lot of people are like, why why should I bother even learning a second language? And by being, actually, I should briefly mention this before we go into it. You're a translator. You're a qualified translator and you do that stuff. So you're the perfect person to ask this. But the amount of people like, why would I learn a second language when AI is becoming such a huge thing? You know, we're not going to need like human translators. We're going to have AI to do it all. So what's your comment on that as a translator?
Open to Pandora's box there.
Let's go.
So the thing is with AI, there's been a lot of debate about it recently with the AI art and everything, artists saying, well, you know, this is stealing our jobs. Yes. This has been something that we as translators have had to deal with for a decade. Google Translate has been around to varying degrees of success. Some from a while ago it sucked. Now it's quite sophisticated. But as translators, we've actually had to learn to adapt to that. So in Australia, if you want to be a translator, you have to be officially certified. You have to have a NADI certification. And part of that is you have to learn how to deal with post-editing. So you have to edit machine-translated texts because a lot of companies will run their work through Google Translate and go, here, we've already done it. And you're like, I can feel my soul leaving my body.
What is this?
Yeah. I had one job where the guy was like, but look, I can just use my phone and just scan it over and it automatically translated it. And I was like, all right. All right.
No.
But so it's something that's existed for a long time. And look, for us, it's a tool. Like, it's like a calculator, right? Calculator makes your job easier if you have to deal with math. So things like machine translation and AI, it definitely does help us with our job. It makes it faster, it makes it easier, but there is a level of human intervention that has to come into it because like we were saying, you can't separate culture and the language. So yeah, machine translation and AI can translate this text word for word or sentence by sentence, however it does it, but there are aspects of it that a machine is not going to understand at this point in time. Yeah. Maybe down the track it will, and my job will be taken completely by a computer. But for now...
Don't jinx it.
I won't. For now, it's just something that we've had to learn to adapt with. And there's, you know, for translators, there's special software that we have that essentially makes our own Google Translate based on our own translations to make our job easier. So it's just a matter of adapting. But you know, yes, you can have AI and you can go, well, I have Google Translate that will translate everything for me when I'm traveling around Japan. And yeah, it will. But there are experiences that you can't get from AI. You know, one of my favorite things when I lived over there was just going to the little izakaya, the random like hole in the wall bars, and sitting down with the little old men of the town, the like leathery fishermen, and just having a drink with them and chatting. And you know, AI and Google Translate can facilitate that to an extent, but, you know, not really. You're not going to get that same experience with a computer.
No, you're not. And I think that is such a great response. And it just really, like, learning a language is never going to go away.
No.
Because there really is so much more from word for word translation. And also to people who haven't learned a language, that's not how language works either.
Not at all.
It is so much more complicated than that. And I think another great thing I would love to talk to you about is Japanese grammar is so far from English.
It is.
Like that, I even struggle a little bit with French grammar and wrapping my head around it, like different word order and stuff. How did you go finding it from, like, because that scares me?
Yeah. Look, it's a lot. It is. So it's completely the other way around. So the verb comes at the end of the sentence. And it's a bit loosey-goosey as well. So French and English, you have a very like strict word order. Japanese can kind of be all over the place if you want. It's kind of like word salad as long as you have like your particles in the right place. But it is a lot. And I think for me, gosh, it's one of those things where when you start out learning a language, it seems really hard because what you're doing is you're taking the English and you're going, right, I have to think about how to reorder this in Japanese or in French, and then translating it in your brain into Japanese. But the more you do it, the more your brain starts to think in Japanese or think in French or think in whatever, and it just becomes second nature and you don't really have to think about it. But there are a lot of things that are, you know, very, very, very different about Japanese.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And I guess, would you say that the more you've engaged, the more that you're not really translating word for word in your head? Like, this is such a very weird concept, and I hope I describe it right. But would you say that you've gotten to a point where you think like you do in English but in Japanese when you speak, or do you still find that you have to translate a bit between languages?
Yeah, it depends. So I'm at the point now where I can think in Japanese. takes me a bit of time sometimes for my brain to switch between the two of them, and sometimes it does get jumbled up. Like I said, I speak Japanese a lot at home with my partner. So, there are times where it's just this odd mush between the two of them. But, when I'm in Japan, it usually takes me about a day and I completely flick over to Japanese and I'm thinking in Japanese. If I, jam my finger in a door, my immediate response is Japanese rather than English. So when you're in Australia, and I think that's one of the hard things for people learning the language is that, Japanese in particular, there's not a lot of opportunity to use it in your everyday life here. You have to go out and kind of seek it. But the more you can do that, the more you can immerse yourself in it, the more it does make it easier to start thinking in Japanese, and you don't have to do that word for word translation in your brain.
Then do you have any recommendation for people who want to really immerse themselves in Melbourne? Like, for instance, I don't know, are there Japanese talking groups? Are there events? Like, have you explored much with that or with your Japanese partner? Yeah,
so I'm at a different stage now than I was, say, like a decade ago when I was studying Japanese. Back then I was seeking out a lot of things. So I might be a little bit outdated in what my resources are here. But, back in my day, one of the things that really helped me was I'm not affiliated with them now, but I was. But I'll give them a plug anyway. The Monash Japanese Club.
We just interviewed them. They're amazing. Go check them out.
So I was on the committee back in the day. I was Gen Com, and that gave me so many opportunities. Monash has a lot of Japanese exchange students that come out here throughout the year, and being on the committee was one of the primary ways that you're able to get involved in that. They Monash College turns to the Japanese Club first to get volunteers to help these students when they come to Australia. So if you want to find native Japanese speakers, get on that committee, join that club, because that's going to be one of the best ways for you to be able to engage with native Japanese speakers. Japan only reopened their borders after COVID, like late October last year, maybe November. So we haven't been able to get any out here recently, but now you've got working holiday and you've got the exchange students starting to come out again. So any opportunity that you can to find them, like I said, Monash gets heaps of them through their doors. So that's probably the best way to do it. And there's a Moodle page for Japanese studies. Sorry to get Monash specific, but and I know a lot of students, I know you guys don't have your email notifications turned on. I know you don't open them, but we do put things in there whenever we have exchange groups popping up or any kind of exchange opportunities. Monash runs a lot so we've got a long-standing association and collaboration with Waseda University and a few other universities in Japan, and we pair you up with people and you can Zoom with them every week and exchange social media with them. Yeah. So, I did that back in my day, and some of those people are still my best friends. I was in Japan in May for one of their weddings.
That's so sweet. Oh, I love that. It sounds like you guys have so many opportunities to engage in the language, which is great because when you are so far away from the country, getting all those contacts you can is amazing. Yeah. I'm jealous. We need to get that in the French program. That sounds amazing.
Get with it, French guys.
Get with it, French guys. Another question that I kind of had was, because you said you were doing research, and I find a lot of people like, oh, then what can I do with a language? Like there's the obvious thing of study a language and pair it with another degree. Yeah. But going down the research route, could you talk a bit about that and how you got into it and like what your research project is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was dead set against not doing research.
I feel like that's how everybody starts when they say, I didn't want to do a PhD, but the PhD chose me.
Oh gosh, no, it didn't choose me. So I did my master's. So okay. When I lived in Japan, I thought that I wanted to come back and do a degree in education. I've jumped all over the place deciding what it was that I wanted to do. So if anyone's kind of like, what the hell do I do? Don't worry, you'll find it eventually. But I wanted to come back and do a degree in education. But when I lived in Japan, I had to do a lot of translation and interpreting work. And I didn't love the interpreting side, but I really loved the translation side of it. So I thought that maybe I'd come back and do a master's degree in translation, which I did. And my, lecturers and tutors and professors at the time stroked my ego and were like, you're so good. You should do research. I was like, no, I'm going to go out there and just do freelance. I'm just going to give it a crack. But they kind of wore me down and they kept giving me the compliments. And I was like, All right. Maybe
Should I? I will.
So, yeah, then I started a PhD. So I work with MPOs over in Hiroshima, translating survivor accounts of the bombing of Hiroshima. My research is, it's a practice-based PhD, so I've translated a whole book. It's one of the earliest collections of survivor testimonies from the bomb. It's collected 5 years after. But because of wartime era occupation, it wasn't allowed to be published because they weren't allowed to talk about anything that was considered anti-American, and discussion of the bomb was considered anti-American. So survivors weren't allowed to tell their stories for about a decade after. So this book wasn't published until 1965. So I have translated it, and I'm looking at specifically how to translate trauma from Japanese into English. But in terms of sort of translation, it is one thing to do. One of the, like you said, students always ask me, like, what do I do with a language? And I have to kind of tell them, like, it's disappointing, but it's not like a engineering degree where you go to uni, you study engineering and you become an engineer, or you go to uni, you study nursing and you become a nurse. You don't go to uni, study Japanese and become Japanese.
No,
that's not a thing.
That's not how it works.
That's not how it works. So you have to kind of think about it as a skill. A skill set, something that's leveling you up, and how can you use it to your advantage in whatever you're doing. So, translation is one area that you can absolutely go into it, and it's like gung-ho, full-on language. But it is a hard kind of area to work in, especially in Australia. So research is one way that I can kind of supplement that with it. And I really, really, really love it. I have done a bunch of translations for these MPOs in Japan, in Hiroshima, peace media translation as well. So the Chugoku Shimbun does a lot of research in Hiroshima, boots on the ground research there with survivors, and then I translate some of that into English. So, it's definitely one way to go, but research is, if you like research, I would recommend it and highly recommend it, and I love it. I wouldn't recommend research if you're just kind of like, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah. And I think, once again, it comes down to the age-old argument of do what you're passionate about, people.
Exactly. And I am testament to that because, my siblings, I'm one of 4 that are all like, what are you going to do with languages? What is a Bachelor of Languages going to get
that
you?
standard family argument of, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, that makes no sense. Why aren't you going to study law? I'm like, because I'm passionate about it. Leave me alone.
Even now, my brothers are like, so you're still a student? And I'm like, no, I'm a researcher.
It's a researcher. Like, it's a bit different.
Yeah. So you have to be passionate about what you do, especially if you're looking to do a PhD, because you're very intimate with your research for 3 years at least.
Yes.
So
it's a long journey.
So you want to have it be something that you're really passionate about, because it can, like languages, there are times where you're like, why am I doing this?
Exactly. Well, I guess another thing that we could talk, and I think you've talked a bit briefly about it, but exchange opportunities,
right.
Monash abroad, because I'm sure you've got students coming up to you all the time like, I want to go to Japan. When can I go to Japan? So if you wouldn't mind elaborating a bit on how that kind of works in Monash and like what level you have to get to and some of the opportunities around it.
Yeah, so I mainly teach an introductory Japanese. So a lot of my students do come to me and go, I want to go on exchange. Probably there are kind of small, short-term exchange opportunities that you can do. They mostly start from at least intermediate though.
Yeah.
Intermediate you can, I believe, I'm not positive because, again, Japan only just opened their borders again, so I'm not certain how much of that exchange has ramped up yet or if they're still a bit hesitant with it. But yeah, there are like 2 to 3 week kind of intense, immersive exchanges that you can do throughout the summer and winter semester breaks. But then if you want to actually do a whole semester or something abroad, you kind of probably want to be at least proficient level to do that. Because you are going to be going to a university in Japan, and
that's intimidating.
Yes. So they do teach some of it in English, but you are also expected to do language units as well in Japanese. So you have to have a particular level of Japanese. If you are interested in doing it, you study. You need to have the grades to do it. And Japanese, can be hard.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very intimidating language from an English speaker. And so I guess to finish up, do you have any final piece of advice to give to people?
Oh, gosh. Again, I guess all I can say is, learn from my experiences. I mean, like I've said a couple of times now, learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. And you have to just stick with it. And there are those times where you'll hate it. And you'll have a really, really, really terrible time. And, we've all been there. Everyone, I feel like across the board, it's a universal experience that you have one semester at university where everything just falls to pieces. Yes. And you just suck. You just do really badly. For me, that was my second semester of Japanese. Across the board, I fell to pieces with all of my units. That semester, so that was introductory 2, I got, I think, a 52 for that unit.
Yeah.
So I barely passed that unit. I think the next semester I worked really hard and I managed to scrape it up to a 54 or something. But I stuck with it because I was like, this is something that I love. At that point, I'd made up my mind that I wanted to go and try living in Japan for a bit. So I really worked hard and worked persistently, and I did just a small amount every day. And that first sort of semester, it was 2 marks difference between my bad semester and the next semester. But then the next semester it was, 70. And then the next semester it was 85. So you do get that exponential growth with it. So even if you have those times where you're so disheartened because there's just so much to learn, the semester's moving so fast and you've got all your other units going on and you just don't feel like you have the time that you can devote to Japanese that you want to, or any other language, you just kind of have to stick with it. And it does get easier. It really does. And don't be disheartened if you have a terrible semester, because I very nearly failed out of Japanese. And look at me now.
The comeback story of the century. I think that is
my arc.
Exactly your hero's journey. Yeah. I think that's wonderful, honestly. Because so many people can get so discouraged.
Absolutely.
But I love that story. I'm sorry. I'm loving that. All right. Well, thank you, Eliza, so much for coming on board.
Welcome.
And to everybody listening, don't forget you can listen back to this recording on YouTube after Language Week is over. And don't forget to stick around for some more music. Anyway, thank you so much.